Good evening. It's time to start. My name is Charles Goodhart, and I'm your chairman for this evening. I've been at LSE for more decades than I like to remember. I would just say that the title of the book that we're talking about, and the author will be talking about this evening, The Illusion of Control, is an absolute perfect fit for the role of a chairman in an event like this. For example, I've been told almost exactly what I'm supposed to say. Now, our speaker tonight is Jón Daníelsson, the author. He is reader of finance and co-director of the Systemic Risk Center and one of the two best Icelandic economists in the world.
One of two?
There are two. I'm not going to say that much about the book, because that's really for John to say. But what I am going to say is what I've been told to say on housekeeping. Now, for Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is #LSE Daníelsson SRC. And Daníelsson has got two S's in it. Please put your phones on silent so as not to disrupt the event. The evening's event is being recorded and should be made available as a podcast later. We also have a photographer here to capture the event, and a selection of photos will be made available on our website. If you are evading arrest or for any other reason you do not want your image to be made available and published, do let us know in advance. There is no fire alarm scheduled for today, so if you hear the alarm or are instructed to leave the building, please do so immediately. It won't be an exercise. So we're just about to hear from John, after which I shall avail myself of my privilege of asking him a number of, I hope, illuminating and searching questions. At the end of that conversation, you will have the chance to ask questions, but please do wait for the microphone to get to you before you start asking your question. And when we open the floor to questions, please, when you have the mic, let us know your name and affiliation and wait for the roving microphone to get to you. That's especially important for the capture of the recording. So without further ado, I shall hand over to John.
Thank you so much, Charles. So Charles has been a friend, a mentor, and a co-author for a quarter century. And I hope that that collaboration will continue for a long time into the future. Now, I do want to welcome you to the magnificent Marshall Building. This is the newest building in the LSE stable of buildings, just opened 6 months ago. And in this very room, I'll be lecturing on risk forecasting tomorrow morning. And this certainly is, the rooms here are certainly the best lecture rooms I have ever seen in my career. So it's a fantastic place. But a book is a personal thing, and I thank you so much for being with me this evening. It is both humbling and it's an honor that you all chose to be here. And being a personal thing, when I was writing this thing, it is what kept me out of mischief for the time I spent doing it. And there are people close to me who are getting very worried as to what I might get up to now that I no longer have the book to occupy me. So whatever the future might entail is probably thanks to this being done. But what is the illusion of control? Well, on one hand, it is the view that the scientists who promise to protect us, scientists in the public sector and the private sector, that they have the best technology for protecting us against financial crisis and against big losses. My contention is that these scientists are perhaps more like somebody counting the grains of sand on the beach and being very happy with their labor, while missing the incoming tsunami coming behind their backs. And this applies both to the public sector and to the private sector. The authorities see it differently. They see crises and losses being caused by capricious, incompetent bankers who are chasing yield, ignoring all the warning signs, and thereby running over a cliff in their vain pursuit of excess losses, but always with everything ending up in tears. Now, they are very proud of themselves, the authorities. Mark Carney wrote, over the past decade, G20 financial reforms have fixed the fault lines that caused the global financial crisis. And you can find many, many similar quotes among the various financial authorities. So how is that something that we believe to be true, or is it inaccurate? Well, the market thinks it's not quite the same way. The market thinks it's the financial authorities who are fixated on the visible, missing out on the real drivers of bad outcomes, focused on excessive compliance, but not seeing the real threats. So who is right? Well, if we ask ourselves, what is it that we want from risk? So imagine the hypothetical distribution of outcomes is a red curve, and we want to reduce the likelihood of bad outcomes and increase the likelihood of good outcomes. In statistics, you thin the lower tail, you fatten the upper tail, or in the language of finance, you lower downside risk and you increase the upside potential. Can we do that? Well, if you want to, you need a mythical device I've called the riskometer, something you plunge deep into the bowels of Wall Street, and out pops an accurate measurement of risk, one we all believe to be true and we all agree is the right measurement of risk. So does this riskometer exist? Well, one problem is they only measure what we have called exogenous risk. 65 billion years ago, an asteroid hit the Gulf of Mexico, killing the dinosaurs. Certainly the dinosaurs did nothing to cause their own demise. The risk was exogenous, it came from the outside. Just about every risk model we know in the private and public sector, including the risk models I will lecture on in this very room tomorrow morning, assume risk is exogenous. That market participants, they receive risk measurements from a riskometer, they react to it, but they don't change risk by reacting. That's what exogenous means. Except it quite isn't so. And there are several reasons. One is the risk measurement problem. Stated simply, the risk we care about is not the risk we measure. If you take the distribution of outcomes in financial markets, the one we saw 2 slides back, the data lives in the middle. That's where we have all the gazillions of observations, all the trading positions, all the losses, all the day-to-day movements of financial markets. We are very, very good at measuring day-to-day events, but that's not what we care about. We care about the tails, the big profits and the big losses, but there is no data there. So what happens in practice is we measure the middle really, really, really well, have fantastic risk models on the middle, and then we say, let's assume those models work for the tail by magic. Now, the problem is there's no way to verify that, because while there are gazillions of observations in the middle, there are no observations in the tail, especially because every big loss is unique. They're all different, so you can't even learn from the past. So you can have the most fantastic machine learning algorithm run by AI, and you get really good at the middle problem, not at the tail problem. So this is one reason why, one ingredient in the illusion of control. Then we have what drives extreme outcomes, politics. all or almost all big events in the economy and in the financial system are driven by politics. The 2008 crisis, the pending crisis in Italy, Brexit, Trump, Ukraine, Hong Kong, Venezuela, real estate, inflation, all has at its root politics, because it's politics that allows risk to emerge, and it's the politics that prevents proper solutions to the problems. If we take perhaps the biggest challenge society faces today, the environment, the inability to deal with it is entirely political. If we take Charles's research topic, demographics, the inability to deal with that is politics. And what can the Bank of England and other central banks do? Well, they are non-democratic by definition, but if bad things are caused by political decisions, how can a non-democratic entity like a central bank implement policies that affect democratic outcomes? Well, they can't. But that means if the financial authorities cannot address political risk, how effective and how legitimate can they be, at least when it comes to macro-pru? And my take is not very. And this next ingredient is the drivers of risk. The crisis in 2008 did not happen because of anything anybody did in 2008. It was decisions made years earlier. The time between decisions and bad outcomes in the financial system is measured in years. In 2003, every sign said, oh, it's fantastic, risk is low. The private sector, the public sector all said, take more risk because risk is low. But in the process, forgetting Hyman Minsky, who said, stability is destabilizing, the 2008 crisis happened because the market saw risk as being low, therefore took more risk, which then culminated in a crisis. And empirically, I verified this in my research, because what we find empirically is that low risk predicts crisis years into the future, predict economic growth years into the future, but measurements of high risk are correlated with low growth and crisis, but do not predict them. And then ask yourself, what's every indicator of tail losses made of high risk? And then, of course, risk has many manifestations. Here are just two. Suppose the US stock market goes down by 200 billion this evening. The market is still open in the US. Well, nobody would care. Not many would care. Because it's known as an unknown risk. It's risk we know, we are prepared for, we are hedged for, and therefore it will not cause any serious damage. In 2008, subprime losses that did not even reach 200 billion, and oh my God, it's almost like the world ended and we got a major financial crisis. That is an unknown type of risk, one that nobody knows exists until it actually materializes. But then you ask yourself, how do you measure unknown risk? You can't. These are the tails I'm discussing. You measure the middle, not the unknown unknowns. The risk we really care about is what we have called endogenous risk. Endogenous risk is the risk caused by, not by an asteroid hitting the city of London, metaphorically or in reality. It's the risk caused by the interaction of all of us. All the human beings that make up the economy, each of us with our own ability, bias, resources, ethics, lot of very smart people chasing profits and being very ruthless in the process. Those people behave differently in good times and in crisis times. In times of heightened market stress, self-preservation kicks in, which is exactly the ingredient behind the dry-ups of liquidity and the sharp price falls we see in times of extreme stress. That is endogenous risk, the risk created by our interaction as market participants. But the risk dashboards we use to control our lives, they are made of exogenous risk. So they can flash green, saying everything is okay. At the very same time, the endogenous risk monster is laughing behind our back, waiting to strike. So what can the authorities do? Well, I call this the regulation trilemma. They have to pick between the alternatives. They can focus on stability, efficiency, or uniformity. They can't pick all three. They have to pick two. And so far, the financial authorities pick uniformity. Idea being similar beliefs driven by everybody using the same riskometer, because if you do see how the financial authorities tell banks to measure risk, they harmonize beliefs because they tell them to measure risk in the same way. And then they tell them to react to the risk in the same way, the way you do that perhaps via bank capital, which has automatic reaction mechanisms to high measured risk. That is correct if and only if A, the riskometer exists, and B, risk is exogenous. Then the problem is like a scientific engineering problem. The thermometer on the wall that keeps his room hopefully at 22 degrees, is usually 24 by the way, but that's a different issue. That's failure of engineering, not finance. The thermometer that promises to keep the room at 22 degrees, if the temperature rises, you turn on the air conditioning. If the temperature falls, you turn on the radiators. It's an automatic rapid feedback mechanisms. That's scientific and that is fair, which is exactly what we want out of regulations. It's scientific in the sense of Karl Popper. What we get is something different. We get fairness and science in the sense of scientific socialism as proposed by Friedrich Engels 150 years ago. And if you know your intellectual history, you know how Karl Popper dealt with that here in LSE. What we should do from the point of view of regulations is to aim for diversity. The more diverse the institutions of the financial system are, the higher the shock absorption capacity of the system. How does that work? Imagine a shock comes along. You want somebody to buy, somebody to sell, and somebody to sit on their hands, do nothing. In aggregate, create random noise. That is shock absorption. You don't want everybody to sell or everybody to buy. That is shock amplification, and that's what we get at the moment. You then want, if you have a diverse system of institutions, you also get financial services that can be tailored to the user, to the saver, and to the borrower, and therefore helping the economy grow because they get the type of service they need and increasing social welfare. We can also lower the cost of regulating because we don't need this army of compliance people and very high buffers to protect us, because instead we get shock absorption. It's a win-win-win situation, more growth and more stability. What gets in the, so how do you do that? Well, it's simple. Actually, quite simple. You tailor regulations to the type of financial institutions we have, instead of what we have now, which is a one-size-fits-all, same type of regulation applied to everybody. You tailor them to the institution. You eliminate barriers to entry, especially for those people with new business models and new ideas. You actively embrace fintech. You actively embraced decentralized finance, perhaps as driven by the central bank digital currencies. And you recognize that usually shadow banking is a friend, not the enemy. Now, if you talk to an authority, they might say yes to all of this. That's theory. That's not how things happen in practice. So what gets in the way? 4 reasons. First is conservatism. We prefer what we know instead of what is new. Second is risk aversion because regulators are not rewarded for success, but they are punished for failure, driving them toward trying to prevent bad outcomes, and that means things that are new. Then we have local maximization because collective failure covers individual failure. If I lose a lot of money today, it's my problem. If I lost a lot of money in the autumn of 2008, well, everybody lost. You are protected by everybody losing money. Right? Collective failure protects individual failure. And of course, what might be the main reason, lobbying, because the incumbent banks like the world just the way it is. Because that means no competition from scrappy new startups, allowing them to collect nice fat rents. And that is the ingredient in the illusion of control. We believe that we are acting to the best benefit of society with the current regulatory system and current risk management system, while achieving precisely the opposite. With that, Charles, I'm waiting to see what you manage to do.
Thank you very much, John. I should have said at the beginning that the present is a very good time to read and discuss this book because quite a number of events have occurred recently, some of which go strongly in favor of what John has been talking about. In particular, the recent LDI crisis, where everyone tended to follow the same mechanism, and that mechanism collapsed under an extreme tail event. I'd just like to read to you a few words from I thought, rather particular good speech that Sarah Breeden of the Bank of England wrote when giving a talk about risk and LDI, liability directed investment. I can't remember what the D stands for. Anyhow, she says, the behavior of financial intermediaries can also matter when a stress hits too, since what can seem rational behavior for an individual firm has the potential to cause negative second-round effects when aggregated across the market as a whole. For example, low initial margins and haircuts in normal times can result in significant margin increases when a stress hits. If these occur market-wide, it can lead to a reduction in market activity, damage market function, and potentially amplify market moves at a time of stress. So the pension fund LDI crisis, which you will remember, I hope, it only occurred about a month ago, goes very strongly in John's favor. There's been another potential crisis in the last week, which I'm not sure goes quite as much in John's favor, which is the failure of a crypto, FTX was it called? Now, you're in favor of diversity, and clearly one of the most diverse developments of recent years has been crypto. But the failures that we've just seen in that exchange and the potentiality of contagion has led everybody to scream, it's not regulated enough. You're in favor of diversity, but is all diversity always good? And if people want to follow what is assumed to be best practice, and how are you going to stop them?
Well, the regulations, or the premise of your question, is that there's a monolithic single block that is called regulations. And if there's a problem, you just increase the intensity and regulate a bit more. But regulations is very far from being a monolithic single entity. I have never advocated, I do not advocate in the book for deregulation. That's not the point I'm making. I'm advocating for intelligent regulations. And the problem with the crypto exchanges, as we saw last week, is failure in micro-prudential regulations. It's allowing institutions to sell products to individuals without having the most minimal safeguards to protect people's investments. That's not something I would ever advocate, and I think no rational person, almost no rational persons can advocate for. So I don't think it goes against me. It's simply saying, in a way, it supports me because it's saying, it supports the view that regulation is not a monolithic block. There are different types of regulations, and what happened in the crypto market last week is precisely where we need better regulations.
Okay, you don't like one size fits all. But if you're going to tailor regulations to all local conditions, the rule book then sort of simply explodes in size. How do you manage the trade-off between simplicity on the one hand and sort of fitting everything to local conditions on the other?
Well, the rule book, of course, the rule book, by the way, is the stack of paper that dictates what you can and what you can't do. And I was once told by somebody working in the FCA, that the rule book in the United Kingdom, if you print it out on A4 paper, would stack up to 2 meters high. That rule book is unmanageable in that size. But I also have learned, when it comes to the rule book, that there are efforts to computerize the rule book. You can write the rule book as formal computer logic, and that has been done. And when you do that, you find inconsistencies and problems with the rule book. You also find that when you have a bot interpreting the rule book, the bot responds immediately and accurately, where a human being responds slowly and inaccurately. So the way to solve this problem is to use formal computer logic as has come from computer science, which allows us to do exactly what we want in a much better way than we do today.
Actually, that leads on to another question I've got, which is, will AI revolutionize risk management and regulation?
Well, it's not that AI will, AI is revolutionizing risk management. Some of you have heard of Aladdin, which is the BlackRock's AI engine. So I sort of classify risk management into 3 generations. First, we had a theory of risk, which is the mean variance optimization Markowitz, the CAPM model. The second generation is the empirical estimation of risk, like the ARCH model, Robert Enkel, and people like that. And what we are now seeing is risk management as a service. What this means is you no longer do risk management internally in a financial institution. You buy it from a specialist provider, which increasingly is BlackRock, which runs an AI engine that collects data on everything you can possibly collect. They harmonize the data. You feed in your positions, and you can let the BlackRock AI do everything for you. Risk management is the prime example of a job that will be, I think in the future, be predominantly outsourced to AI and not done by human beings as today, which of course has rather profound implications for our master students, but that's a different issue. But coming back to that, risk management is precisely the domain where AI will perform well. Where AI cannot perform well is in macroprudential regulations, because that's where the problems are different. So AI will be really good and revolutionize risk management, but if being allowed to do macro-pro will be disastrous.
One query that is very close to my own particular interests is that you say that you're very much against silo mentality. Does that mean that you would prefer to merge the MPC and the FPC rather than have them separate?
I worry about central banks having too many jobs, which is perhaps not answering your question, right? Silo mentality means the following in the context Charles is asking that, which is that financial institutions operate globally. A bank can have a trading position in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, China, and Japan. The regulators in each of these countries only see their own leg of the transactions. They don't see both sides of the transaction. Therefore, the financial authorities cannot see what's going on outside of their own jurisdiction. And that even within the same country extends to different regulators who only see data pertaining to activities within their own domain, not other domains in the same country. That's a silo. There's multiple silos in the regulatory space, and it is impossible, I'm told, politically, to do anything about it. It's politically impossible because regulators refuse to share data, and certainly not to other countries, and that is not about to change. So that's the silo mentality I'm talking about. The thing is, if you make the system more diverse, the silo problem becomes less important. So the diversity is one way to address exactly the problem of the silos, which is not a problem you can solve.
Earlier, you said that we've got lots of data on what goes on normally. We have no data on the tails. But in the index to your book, and I didn't read the whole of your book again before this evening, I saw no mention of stress testing. Now, isn't stress testing an attempt to try and think through what might happen if? And therefore, isn't the adoption of stress testing the right way to go ahead in regulation generally?
No. You want a longer answer? Okay, I can do that. So stress testing is a sensible thing. What stress testing means in practice is, and if you allow me, or forgive me for excessively simplifying it, what it means is, if you forecast the risk to be low in one state of the world, you artificially increase it, because if you run the same risk forecast model over a previous historical stress event, that would have been the risky outcome. So all that is doing is, what the stress test is doing is doing exactly what I said in this slide here, which is, it is taking the data that lives in the middle and say, I'm artificially scaling it to the tails, and therefore I must be doing the right thing. The problem with stress tests is the following. I can promise you two things, and I'm willing to bet against everybody on those two things. The first is, there will be another financial crisis. And secondly, that crisis will happen in a different place than every other previous financial crisis. Because what happens is, after every crisis, we solve the problem that caused that crisis. The problem is, the financial system is effectively infinitely complex. And not only that, it is endogenously infinitely complex. And nobody in the financial system has an incentive to reduce complexity. Everybody in the private sector, academia, the public sector, everybody is incentivized to increase complexity. So therefore, the next crisis will be different. So if you use a previous crisis as a guide for how to stress test, you are really missing out on what causes the crisis. You can end up with very high buffers. Because if all you end up doing is you end up with very high capital buffers at the end of it that might not afford much protection, you're just slowing down the economy, imposing costs. So while stress tests are certainly useful, and we should certainly do them, they do not solve the problem.
Okay, another thing that you complain about is short-term performance measures. And I understand why you complain about them, particularly after the pension fund debacle for a particular reason. But how can I possibly distinguish, if somebody that I hire as a manager of funds, how can I distinguish if their short-term performance is bad, whether it is bad because they are sort of concerned about long-term, or just that they're bad managers? And how do you ever get away from sort of focusing on short-term performance?
Of course you can't, right? The problem Charles is saying is, so if you take There's a particular example I mentioned in the book. There's a particular sovereign wealth fund I talked to about this. What they said, we care about 10-year risk, but then we monitor our risk takers quarterly. So what happens is, the effective time horizon for that particular sovereign wealth fund goes from 10 years, which is what they care about legally, into 3 months, which is what they do in practice. And this happens everywhere. Of course, the problem is exactly when we are monitoring, we get exactly the problem on the slide, is that we use the data in the middle to give us protection against the tails. And, however, there are ways to deal with that. And here's a wrong way. There's an example in the book, by the way. Some years ago, I was asked by LSE to talk to pension fund managers from Latin America, Chile, in this particular case. And they told me they use a technique called value at risk for controlling risk as the primary risk measure. And I think this is just about the only time in a public event where I was speechless. I was like, I couldn't say a word for like a minute. Value at risk is a technique for day-to-day risk control on trading portfolios. And they were taking that and applying that to multi-decade horizons for risk. You could not be more wrong. So when I have been asked by people who were doing long-term investment in practice, what I tell them is, if the risk managers, if you only monitor them by high-frequency statistical measurements, you will end up in the wrong place. If that person says, we have thought about this very problem. We know how risk aggregates over time. We know our clients are not concerned with day-to-day losses. They're concerned with long-term losses. They formulate strategies. If you talk to a sensible pension fund manager, they know exactly what the problem is. So you can identify the individuals by how they approach the problem and hopefully pick the right person that way.
Very good. I think it's now time to open up questions from the floor. When the mic gets to you, could you please say your name and affiliation before you ask your question?
Michael von Brentano. I was surprised that you did not give more emphasis to the political factors. In my opinion, the biggest financial crisis in recent times were the German inflation 1924, which had tremendous political implications, the American crisis of 1929, and in the 50s, the departure from the gold standard by Nixon. These were events which normal business people could not influence, but they had a much bigger impact than practically anything they could do.
No, I mean, that's exactly what my slide here is saying, is that I think almost every large negative outcome in financial markets is at its core a political decision, both for good and for bad. So a country that makes systematically good political decisions ends up being prosperous. And a country that makes systematically bad decisions ends up being non-prosperous. In the events you are discussing, of course, the politics was the reason why the United States couldn't fight inflation and why they had to exit Bretton Woods in 1972, which is exactly correct. So I completely agree with your assertion that politics is behind every bad outcome, almost every seriously bad outcome in financial markets.
I'm George Lemos. I'm a regulated person suffering from regulation in CFSL, which is my financial business. I wanted to ask a doxographical question, which is that more than 40 years ago, there's a chapter in that wonderful book, After Virtue, by Alistair MacIntyre, which has the title, The Character of the Character of Generalizations in Social Science and Their Lack of Predictive Power. And he seemed to be saying then pretty much what you're saying now. And I was wondering whether it had an influence on you or whether it's had any influence on economists generally in the 40 years that have passed since it was published.
I have to admit I am not familiar with that, but the way you state it sounds exactly like what I was saying. And if you so I've read a fair bit of sociologists along the way, and one I quote in the book was the one who stated the McNamara fallacy, which is quite similar, because when McNamara was running the Vietnam War in the 1960s, his strategy was to measure everything that could be measured, including, this is why the United States, for those of you who remember the Vietnam War, they counted body bags as one measurement of success in that war. And what the Yankelevich, who was the sociologist who studied that, said this is sheer madness, because if you count things, you ignore what you can't count, and that's where things go wrong. But if you could send me an email with that reference, I would love to get it, and I think this sounds like a book I would love to read.
Kevin James, Systemic Risk Center. So if the major crises are mostly influenced by politics, then how is tailoring the regulation to different entities going to actually solve that problem? Is that really the key thing to do? Or is it to design some system that's more robust to political malfeasance?
Well, I thought that's exactly what I was proposing. There are certain problems you can't solve. You cannot make human beings wiser or more rational or better behaved. You cannot make politicians less corrupt and less capricious and more intelligent. You can't solve the political problem. You cannot solve the problem of democracy. And I'm very much with Winston Churchill that democracy is the worst system of government except all the others. So that's a given. However, what you can do, and that is at the core of my idea, you can make the system much more resilient than it is today. You can make it resilient to some of these political shocks. You do that by increasing shock absorption capacity. You also, if you make the system deliver for society, if you increase social welfare and you make the economy grow by making regulations work for society much better, you also hopefully might reduce the political pressures, those very political pressures that lead to the worst outcomes, like the extreme left-wing and right-wing populism we are seeing today. So of course we can't solve every problem, but we can make a step in the right direction, and that's all I'm proposing.
Krishai's PhD candidate at the law school. You said that AI will take over risk management. Is that a factual prediction or a normative claim as to what should be done?
It is not, I didn't say it will, I said it is. Okay. It is and that's exactly, if you're interested in that, I mean, I have a long discussion in my book about exactly that process, but the place to look is BlackRock's Aladdin.
Is it something that you support? Or encourage?
I mean, I see no problems with AI taking over risk management, because we employ a huge army of risk managers, and these costs a fortune, and those costs are paid for by society. And if you can outsource that to AI, why not? I mean, I see no problem with that process.
AI is only as good as the data that you have. Wouldn't just lock in the endogenous risk or even reinforce it?
But you might say that, but the problem is that when you model risk, and which is exactly the lecture I will give tomorrow, which is exactly on how you model risk, you're not free to do what you want. Financial regulations are very prescriptive in how you model risk. You have to do things in a certain way. So what you end up is, the rule book we mentioned tells banks you have to model risk in this way. So all you're doing is you're replacing a person with a master's degree in mathematics or finance or economics or statistics or physics with a computer doing exactly the same job, but much more cheaply.
There's 3 queries over there.
Rupert Goodwin, the London Quant Group. John, I think there's one thing that we should try and clarify a little bit, which is that your focus primarily is at the global market scale of risk and financial system, as opposed to thinking about an individual portfolio or an individual pension fund. So thinking about the risk of a pension fund relative to some long-term strategic benchmark is a real thing that you can attempt to model and manage, but within the context of the stability of the financial system overall. And I've read your book, I love it. I mean, it infuriated me because I just couldn't put it down. An entire day vanished reading it. And it's brilliant. But I think it's important to understand that, the big systemic source of risk that you're worried about can and do submerge those people who are doing, should we say, local risk management on a particular portfolio or on a particular set of funds. But nonetheless, you've got to do something. And throwing out all risk and all riskometers doesn't seem to be totally helpful.
Rupert, that's not what I'm saying. There are certain people, certain well-known people that claim that all risk modeling is nonsense. And these are persons you probably all have heard of or make these claims repeatedly. I would never say that. I've written a book called Financial Risk Forecasting, and I teach exactly that very subject here in this room tomorrow. I mean, I do not think you cannot do risk management. You certainly can. However, what I am saying is you should understand the tools you have and apply the tools correctly. What you can do correctly and efficiently is to manage risk on the trading floor, which is where a lot of data lives. You can manage risk in high-frequency trading portfolios relatively quite well. You can manage risk in assets that are known unknowns, like equity portfolios, quite well. But as you move away from that domain, you manage risk increasingly poorly. And it's a recognition of that process of going from doing a really quite a decent job in the middle of the distribution to the tails. It's a recognition of that process, which is what I'm stressing.
David Green, a former banking supervisor in several jurisdictions. John, when I first became a banking supervisor many decades ago, when I was first in the job, I found I couldn't actually master all the data about the firms I was supervising. I was supervising 120. And my boss said to me, "Oh, don't worry about all that. Just remember what the job is." And he said, the job is to find out whether the management understand how they make money. And you keep asking them questions to see whether they are using your general knowledge, and you're expected to be generally well informed. Keep asking them questions, find out if they understand. If they don't understand, you have a problem. You then go on and ask them questions to ask them whether they understand what could happen to stop them making money. And if they don't produce good answers to that, it's probably too late. Now, this approach was discredited and abandoned for a number of very good reasons, which are partly touched on in your presentation. The lack of reliance on data, legal issues, the inability to enforce, and so on. And so that was abandoned in favor of a lot more rules-based approach for reasons that you described very well. However, nevertheless, a lot of the crises which have taken place since then, and I've been involved in a few of them in Ireland and Cyprus and Switzerland and other places, did have a major element which turned on the management not understanding how they made money or not understanding the risks. I wonder what your recommendations are, as how you put all these different elements together, the hard data, but also the very soft issues about management knowing what they're doing.
I fully agree with what your first boss told you. I think it's a very sensible idea. And it's one that we keep on discussing, and the problem is it's rejected for the wrong reasons. It's rejected because it is not scientific or fair. This is exactly my point on the slide. I think the problem is you created instead a system that ends up a little bit like scientific socialism, which does not meet the basic elementary scientific criteria. So if you look at recent big bank losses and who avoided them, some banks have a culture, and I think culture is a key element in this. Some banks have a culture of understanding where profits are made and knowing that profits don't magically appear for no reason, and they understand the risk these institutions are taking. I think risk culture is key to this. And in the book, which I didn't mention in the slides, I strongly emphasize the element of risk culture as an element in how one should think about risk internally in financial institutions and in regulations. So exactly asking the questions, where do profits come from and what happens if certain assumptions change is exactly the right question to ask. And therefore we might need to overcome the legal obligations and legal and practical obligations to that. But problem is we try to solve those soft approaches, common sense approaches, with statistics, and the statistics didn't work any better. So I like what your old boss said.
There's another question over there. Two questions over there.
Daniel Beunza. I am a sociologist of finance at Bayes Business School. So John, one core thesis of the book is that the imperfect measurement of risk is what itself causes risk. And my question is about non-quantitative forms of risk management and about size. So at the end of the day, people take decisions that involve risks without necessarily quantifying, say in the realm of politics or health or other areas of economic life. And this typically involves a conversation between somebody taking risks and somebody managing that person. So my first question to you is, what about these non-quantitative ways of making decisions about risk? What is your view of them? The second question is, one way of looking at quantifying risk is that measuring is a way of summarizing data. So you measure something very complex and you boil it down to, say, a central indicator in a probability distribution. But what that also allows is for the risk manager to be in control of a greater and greater entity, so that the illusion of control becomes the justification of control. And in many ways, the size of the banks have been increasing, not decreasing, since the last financial crisis. So what is your view on the relationship between size of the economic entity and the problems caused by risk management? And should we be limiting the size of banks?
Thanks, Daniel. And by the way, for those of you who don't know Daniel, he is one of the world's foremost authority on culture in banks. So where I got my ideas on risk culture from reading his books, so he's a direct influence on what I'm saying is. So to try to distill your two questions into one, financial institutions banks are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. The EU, or the ECB, has as a formal policy not to allow anybody to get a banking license within the EU, which I think is a horrible, horrible policy. They want banks to become bigger. They don't want more small banks, which is just the wrong way of doing things. If you take the United States, the number of banks is declining at a fairly steady rate of 2.4% a year and has been doing so for the past 40 years. Having a handful of the problem with having fewer and fewer big banks is there's a multitude of problems that creates. First of all is these banks become too big to fail. They're systemically important. So we have to do everything we can to prevent them from failing. And that means all sorts of risk management, all sorts of buffers, all sorts of control. It increases the cost of providing financial services, which is highly damaging. And secondly, they don't provide a good service to society. Diversity solves these problems. It makes the financial institutions much smaller. They're more tailored to they're more tailored to the market they are in. They allow for entrepreneurships, and we do know that the engine of growth is small entrepreneurs. We do know that entrepreneurs that run their own companies have a much better handle on the problem of control, exactly as you're saying. So I think the problems you highlight are very much solved by my idea of diversity.
One more over there, and then there are two there.
My name's Adam Ridley, and I've been in my day a regulator of insurance and ran the London Investment Banking Association and negotiated much of the Financial Services and Markets Act with the FSA, and then a whole slew of regulations and consultations under that act until it was unfortunately abandoned by a succeeding government. I'd like to ask two questions and offer one observation. The first question is, I'm slightly mystified about the assertion that all these major crises that you've been thinking about are inherently political. As I listened, I started jotting down and came straight away up with the following three, obviously not political: the Lloyd's insurance market, which I was involved in, the Dutch tulip crisis a few hundred years ago, and the South Sea bubble. And then you might add 2007-9. I don't really see that as fundamentally political. Of course, there were lots of political involvements in it, but the crisis itself I don't see as political. Okay, my second question relates to the assertion, which I perhaps fail to understand, and I must freely confess I haven't yet read your book. You said you can never get all the details on a transaction, and countries are autarkic and they'll never share the information with one another that enables one to get that. And I'm looking hard at David Green because I suspect he would agree with me that actually it's wrong to think of transactions taking place in an inherently national context, A. To the extent that they're involved in exchanges, the exchanges have their own structures and respond internationally more and more, and particularly in the framework of the EU, just had to have all the information there on both sides of the transaction. So I don't understand that point at all. It sounds to me as if it's fundamentally wrong. On the matter of banks, there is, I think, further evidence to support your observation about what actually happened, and I'm looking hard at Charles at this moment. My experience in dealing with the Bank of England over some 40 or 50 odd years was that it never liked small banks at all. And it set higher capital adequacy standards for them and practiced every discreet and friendly kind of discouragement that was known to man in order to keep the numbers down. And if you questioned this, which I did with a good number of people at various times, they would say things like, well, you know, they're much more risky. And I said, well, what are the objective measures of risk you're talking about? And they flannelled. And then one said, are you suggesting that they are inherently more systemic, perhaps collectively, than a really big bank is? And there was more coughing and spluttering. So I have to share very much that suspicion that you uttered at the end. Anyway, I hope that you can help me with the other two questions.
So I actually okay, now if in the book, I define the first modern financial crisis as happening in 1763. So both the tulip crisis and the South Sea bubble predate 1763. So in my classification, it's a pre-modern crisis. They happen in a context that just wouldn't happen today. And of course, neither of these things were political. I fully agree with that. But 2008, I disagree with what you said. And I would suggest you read the book by Charlie Calomiris, a professor in Columbia, who wrote, I think, the best book on the crisis. And what he says is the following, which I found fascinating. At the root of the crisis was subprime mortgages and structured credit products. The reason these existed was that in the United States, politically, there was an alliance between the far-left activists and bank lobbyists that on the following note. The banks wanted to be allowed to merge. The far-left activists wanted housing for the poor. So therefore, every time a bank merger was opposed by somebody, the far-left political activists and the bank lobbyists came together and were able to overcome all objections. It was the very political mission of houses for the poor in the United States that starts with an act whose name I forget in 1974, but I mentioned in the book, that then led to the creation of all the financial instruments that then culminated in the crisis in 2008. And that is why I said that crisis was inherently political, because it was really US domestic politics and that unholy alliance that caused it. And I would refer you to Charlie Calomiris' book, because it's absolutely excellent on that point. On the second point, the exchange sees both legs of the transaction, but the regulator does not. And that's the point.
Are you really confident about it?
Yes, I actually am confident, because we do have this, before we left the European Union, we had this database called EMIR, which was all about reporting trades within the EU. And what happened is that a bank trading with Europe, with Germany and the UK, the UK leg was reported to the Bank of England. The German leg was reported to the ECB, and they would not be allowed to share. And what happens is legally, and this is a particular German problem I learned by talking to an expert, is banks own copyright on data. So the banks, when they reported data, they retain copyright, and they license the data to the regulator. So the regulator is legally allowed to use data for particular purposes specified in legislation, but not outside of that, because it's in the bank's gift to allow regulators to do that, and they don't. So therefore, you can monitor within a regulated entity transactions and verify the compliance with law. But if you want to ask a question, do these banks constitute systemic risk, for example, which is macroprudential regulations, you quite often will find that the desk in the Bank of England dealing with systemic risk is not allowed to see the data that the colleagues in the compliance department see. So therefore, I think these silos very much exist even to this day. The exchange sees it because it trades both sides, but the regulators don't.
There are two questions over here.
Hi, I'm a student here studying financial history. My question is relating to AI and then technology, especially, excessive dependence on technology in the finance space right now, because there are more technocrats designing the policies without understanding the ground realities. Now, especially, we have two incidents. One is that during the LTCM crisis also in 1998, they came out with some, the hedge fund was heavily invested into the technology, and their models pointed out that, almost zero chance of disaster. But immediately after that, that hedge fund gone bankrupt, and then it almost created a lot of turmoil in the global markets. And very recently, even Bank of England, before this LDI crisis, now reportedly they also conducted stress test about this LDI just a couple of weeks before the disaster. And these stress tests, they gave clean chit to their strategies. So especially when we are having this kind of models and then this kind of output, how can we depend on, to what extent we can depend on technology and then AI, especially in the risk management of the financial institutions? Because when they go bankrupt, they are almost creating systemic risk kind of event.
I mean, I really think, I agree with everything you said, but I really think, therefore, the systemic risk is contained by diversity, by having a large number of different small financial institutions instead of big monolithic banks. So you can never solve the problem of systemic risk, but you can significantly mitigate it. Is exactly what diversity do. So I very much agree with the thrust of your argument.
Hi, I'm Oscar Byrel from Monarch. So you talk about how AI is and likely will continue to have a bigger role in terms of risk management. Now, you could see risk management tools, AI-based risk management tools, is basically a best solve for how to minimize risk. Do you think that there's a risk of there being a trade-off between that and diversity, in the sense that if you have a lot of AI tools, all they're trying to do is the best thing, especially an extreme example where Aladdin is basically doing the same tool for all actors, that they end up acting in uniform. And so effectively you have examples of high frequency trading and risk of flash crashes, because effectively all tools are reacting the same way because they're based on AI systems. So that's the first question in terms of whether there's a trade-off between diversity and reliance on AI. And the second bit, in terms of risk management tools, Aladdin, and to the extent that they, whether you believe that derivatives, shorting of various sorts, is a net benefit to risk management in terms of reducing the risk of bubbles and hedging overall, or whether you think that they pose greater systemic risk because people don't appreciate the complexities of it and it increases the leverage in the system.
So on the first question, AI and technology generally is certainly accelerating the process of harmonized beliefs, which is, and you don't need AI for that. Just the fact that somebody like me writes a book called Financial Risk Forecasting, which is then taught in a lot of places, the fact that we educate people, and I educate people in risk forecasting, a lot of other people do, learning more or less the same thing in universities around the world. All these people enter the job market and do more or less exactly the same thing because they've been taught the same thing and have the same skill set. You don't need AI for this. This is just an innate part of technology. So I don't think the AI necessarily makes it much worse. It just accelerates a process that's already underway and will happen. You can't prevent AI from doing, you can't prevent that process. It will happen. However, the one place where I sort of take an issue with what you're saying is, which is, you can harmonize beliefs, but you don't have to harmonize actions. And in a crisis, in a stress scenario, what you need is somebody who is able to take positions that put a floor under the market. To quote by Baron Rothschild 250 years ago, as I did quote in the book, where he said that the best time to buy real estate is in the middle of a civil war. So somebody has to have the ability to buy when the markets are crashing. That's how you stop them from crashing, put a floor under them. And that is where regulations and best practices get in the way. So you want somebody who can make a gut decision and say, I think this is the best decision for me and my firm, regardless of what regulations say. As to the second problem, derivatives are both a huge benefit and a huge problem. I mean, they certainly provide a very valuable service to society in terms of hedging of all sorts, but they also create hitherto unknown risks, and they're a major driver of the unknown unknowns we have. And however, derivatives also, because they are fundamentally a mathematical construction, they are also something whose risk can be fairly easily modeled if one is willing to model it. So it is the mathematics of derivatives that gives us the ability to understand the risk in them. Whether we are willing to do so or not is a different matter of society. But they are just transforming a basic asset into something else with a well-known process, and that gives you the ability, and AI can quite possibly allow us to aggregate the risk of derivatives into something important to see whether they cancel out or they amplify. So in a way, I see AI as solving the problem of derivatives rather than making it worse.
Any further questions? One, two, over there.
Chris David, no particular affiliation. I was struck by your passing reference to crypto and decentralized finance and fintech and the potential value that it has as an area of innovation, not only in finance but in financial risk management. More flippantly, given what is now happening in those particularly the cryptocurrency markets, and the fact that they are largely deregulated or unregulated casinos or Ponzi schemes, whatever you want to call them, do they pose a threat to the broader financial system?
No. Now, I can amplify that, but the reason why, so crypto, they are micro-prudential concerns. But of course, for a society, we allow people to smoke and have motorcycles in the United States. You're not even required to have a helmet. You can jump out of airplanes into all sorts of dangerous things. And why shouldn't an individual not be allowed to put the money into a crypto exchange if they're so pleased? However, the reason why they are not systemic is that the crypto market is, on the grand scheme or scale of things, tiny. These firms are small, the market is small, and no matter whatever happens in that market, at the moment, it does not pose any serious threat to society.
There's two over there, one in front and one behind.
Hi, my name is Melanie Erspamer, and I'm a PhD candidate at the European Institute here. So I'm kind of an outsider to this discipline. I do political philosophy. But from what I understand of your argument, it seems that you're saying that the profile of risk distribution has these tail ends of unknowns that cannot be measured and so must be addressed structurally through diversifying financial institutions. Now, if that's right, what gain is there by calling the tail end of the risk derived from political factors alone? I mean, it seems to imply to me that the functioning of financial institutions would be without unknowns were it not for political factors. And yeah, I'm not sure what is gained analytically by that. And for instance, with the 2008 example, I mean, I'm personally skeptical about the power of left-wing activists, but if that were true, it's not as though housing problems are unrelated to financial institutions to begin with. So it feels like a bit of an incomplete assessment.
Okay, so let me do this in sequence then. So really quickly, since we're also running out of time here, the point of politics is simply to say big outcomes in financial markets are caused by politics. And in the context of this discussion, this might be obvious to somebody working on politics in the European Institute. This is not as obvious to somebody working in the financial system, because, and then of course, to you it might be obvious you can't simply model this statistically, because you do know that these political factors, they have their own different dynamics. But the reason analytically why I mention this explicitly is because for the people working in this field, this is a fairly controversial thing to say. This is why I'm saying it this way. Now, on what I said in the United States, I'm going by what Charlie Calamiri said in his book, right? And I'm not. So this is not my expertise. So he co-wrote this book. He is a professor of finance in Columbia, and he co-wrote it, I believe, with a sociologist. in the United States. And this is not a book that you would see as a right-wing or left-wing. It's a apolitical book. But what politically happened in the United States is, what in the context is saying is, there was an act passed in the United States in 1974 that stipulated the government was required to move towards helping people who did not have property to buy property. And then as a part of that is a movement to say banks should operate in neighborhoods that are not served by banks otherwise. That laudable political objective attracted a large number of activists on the left and on the far left spectrum in the political spectrum in the United States, who pushed for legislation and activities in the system to advance the objectives of this act. And then what happened is, when banks came to merge in the United States, which they have been doing at the rate of 2.5% in the past 35 years, that merger can be opposed by the community. And then what happens is, and this is what they document in repeated political battles in various states, is that some of the biggest supporters of bank mergers were the activists for the people that advocated for them having access to cheap housing. And the way that was achieved was by the banks creating products that made it easier to buy houses. That's the unholy alliance I'm saying. So this is well documented. I mean, this is not my expertise, but I refer you to the book by Charlie Calamiris. And if you find this argument unconvincing, send me an email and we can have a discussion.
I'm going to allow one more question behind.
Thank you very much. Antti Suhonen, Aalto University. Thank you very much for a great conversation, and look forward to reading the book. Just to dovetail to the previous conversation, I think the point has been very well argumented about those policies being part of the root cause for the financial crisis, and actually what was behind that was a very nasty practice by banks in redlining certain communities which were primarily inhabited by minorities. And there was a very good reason for the activism and what then followed. My question to you is, and I think you touched upon this point a few times, and you made a very, I think, a great case for the fact that there has to be a buyer of last resort in a crisis. So who do you think that buyer of last resort could be? Because the avenue we seem to be taking right now is that yes, we have made banks safer. Banks are not willing to step in and take the risk. Maybe they shouldn't. Now we worry about the shadow banking system. And we're saying, well, shadow banks should be more regulated because they are taking all this risk. And fundamentally, somebody has to take the risk somewhere. We cannot have growth, we cannot have societal benefits without somebody taking the risk. Do you think that point is being really understood and communicated well to the powers that be?
No. I refer you to, there's a really good document on this, which if anyone is interested in the official view, it's called I forget the exact title, called the Holistic Analysis of the COVID-19 Crisis Interventions, published in November 2020, written with a very heavy Bank of England input. They were apparently the main driver of this document, co-authored with the IMF, the FSB, and a bunch of other central banks. The thrust of that case, and I discuss it in the book exactly what they said. What they say is the banks held up well in the COVID crisis. The non-banks held up badly. We had to support them. That's why we have to bring the non-banks into the regulatory umbrella. Some they don't say it that way. This is sort of, and I talked to people who wrote this report, I know several, and some of them got quite cross with me when I interpreted the report this way. Apparently it's highly political. Half of them wanted to go in this direction, half of them didn't. But the thrust of the document is to bring everybody under the banking regulation umbrella. You might read this document differently and come to a different conclusion, but I'm told by people in the regulatory domain that this is the roadmap for how the financial authorities in the major economies see regulations are heading in the years and decades to come. This is harmonization along the bank regulation type. So therefore, this point is not well understood by the powers that be. However, individuals within them, I've talked to a lot of people within the regulatory world who very much see things differently. But that's not. But if you just look at how regulations evolve and how senior people speak, that understanding does not translate into action, as far as I can tell.
I think we'll all agree that John has done a wonderful job in answering all your questions and mine this evening. So before we disappear to drinks and nibbles, which I believe are available outside, can we all give him a jolly good round of applause?